I took a group of boys out to our friend's house in the suburbs to swim the other day. And of course, being 10 and 11 like they are, they were rowdy. And they decided they were going to try to stand up on pool floats and see if they could stand on top of the water. Well, you can imagine the chaos that this created. And everybody fell in. They might stand up there a couple of seconds, but of course there was lots of splashing and screaming and one-upsmanship and all the stuff that comes with this wonderful group of kids. And they finally got tired of that, and eventually they got down in the pool and were floating around on their backs, being quiet. And one of them noticed that when they were still, they could float. And I want to begin our conversation with that this morning, and also call out the photo that I began the service with, which is of Lake Manzanita with Mount Lassen at Lassen National Park in the background, up toward Mount Shasta. And if that picture is really cool, because if you flip it upside down, the water is so still in it, it's really hard to tell it's upside down. And so I wanna bring this idea of floating and calmness into our conversation as we begin first with John's version of the walking on water story, and then with Matthew's. Now, this also shows up in the book of Mark. We've talked about how if stories show up in multiple places, they were important, they were part of the oral tradition. Uh, and I think also when a story is told over and over in different places, it sort of lends some credence to it being something important, something that perhaps happened or a version of it happened. So let's dive in. No pun intended. I don't make up these water puns when we're doing this. Dive in. Okay, so John's version of this kind of sees it's kind of more focused on Jesus and who Jesus is. So I want you to notice that. Notice also the time of day. We have talked about how God shows up in the dark at night. I was laying there last night in bed thinking about all the things I had to do that were on my running list before we leave this week and go out of the country. So, I'm laying there awake at 3 o'clock in the morning running this list. And I wonder if sometimes we have bad dreams at night and they wake us up, or we wake up with anxiety about what's going on in our lives. And some of you have way bigger things to cause you to be anxious at night besides what I'm describing. And I really think it is there if we can get still enough and quiet enough and calm enough that God will show up for us. So I want to note that this happens in the dark. This story happens in the dark, which I think makes the storminess, the wind, the sea even more scary when it's dark. His disciples came down to the sea, got into a boat, and started to cross to Capernaum. It says again, it was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. It's a little bit of, what I hear in that? He'd not yet come to them. Maybe there's a little bit of longing for him in that darkness, longing for the divine. Something we certainly feel when we are awake in the middle of the night, wrangling with our stuff. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. Okay, first of all, I just want to say I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to row a boat for a long distance. Um, I I got too far up the Navarro River one night in a kayak, and the tide started to come in, and we had to row back against the tide for several miles. And I have never been so sore in my life as I was the next morning. So I want you to think about that state of mind as you row and row and row. So there's tiredness, there's uh, wishing they would get there. And they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. Well, of course they were. You know, these stories where somebody says, "Do not fear." I always lift that up at Advent when we have all these angels showing up, and in here's Zechariah in the temple on his big day, his once in a lifetime day that he's serving in this capacity in the temple, lighting the incense. And here comes an angel and stands by him in there when the whole community's looking at him. And what's the angel say? Don't be afraid. And I just want to say, yeah, right. Because, when we encounter divine things, it's scary. It's very hard to be calm when we are in the presence of the divine. And yet, that is a challenge that I wonder if we can arise to. And there's a sense of, when we're in the presence of the divine, there's a sense of overwhelm and awe and excitement. And there can also be a sense of deep peace and calm. So, we've talked about how there, different parts of something can show up. And so these are different responses to being in the presence of the divine. Here they are terrified because they're out in the dark. It's windy. They've been rowing forever and they're not making a lot of headway, apparently. They're scared. Of course they are. And he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." They wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Okay, so this story is a little more anticlimactic than the ways that Mark and Matthew tell it, which we'll get to in a second. I think the focus here for John is not on the disciples, but on who Jesus is. John is telling us that Jesus is a fully divine, fully human being who has these capacities to do miraculous things. One of those things is to be in control of nature. I want you to notice in these stories, nature can be a terrifying thing. I have friends back in the Midwest that just went through a tornado. And fortunately, it took the roof off the garage and the barn and not the house itself, but they still have stuff all over their yard and it's a real mess. And so the wind can be a really scary thing. Again, different sides of it. We go outside, we feel the breeze on our faces. It's so nice. Cools us off when it's hot. And then you get too much wind and it's like, whoa, I got to take shelter here. And it's the same thing with water. The water can be, feel that spritz of water on our faces. One of the things I do when I fly, I take a little spritz bottle that's about this big and fill it up with water and just a tad of lavender essential oil. And then if I get uncomfortable on the flight, I spray my face. And that water really is helpful. But if you've ever been through a flood, you know that water can also be scary. So we have these different faces of these elements. Too much air, too much fire, or just the right amount. There and Jesus has seems to have control over all of this. There's also an element here I want you to notice from the book of Genesis, where when God does the creating in the first part of Genesis, Uh, the deep, the waters were a very scary place. I think the word chaos is actually used to describe that. So, and later on in the Hebrew Bible, it will talk about there being creatures. There's one called Leviathan, like the it's a dragon-like creature in the deep, in the sea. So the sea could be a scary place. It evokes another of my fun movies called Pirates of the Caribbean, where the Kraken comes out. It's that kind of animals. They're creatures that live in the ocean, some real and some not. And so I want you to realize, to these folks, the sea would have been a very chaotic sort of place where strange things resided. And Jesus can walk across it all. Isn't that marvelous? But then we segue to Matthew, and Peter's going to give it a try, which I think speaks more directly to us. So, Matthew 14, this is Matthew's version of the story. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. Again, this is dancing in tandem with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So that's also the case here. After Jesus had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. This is never a bad idea. This is never a bad idea to go up. There's an element, again, a natural element of going to a high place, which is a part of the spiritual traditions of many indigenous cultures. Going to a high place. There are also places in the world where temples are built on high places. I have had the privilege of hiking up Patrick, which is the mountain that in Ireland, where there's a temple on the top. Or I didn't get a hike up Glastonbury Tor because my ankle was broken. I had to stay at the bottom and take pictures, which still turned out good, by the way. Um, but that idea that high places are places where we can encounter the holy. This is also true of natural places in general, beautiful natural places. Some of you may go to rivers or oceans. The ocean is easily accessible here. I think we should probably all try to see it a little more often. It's a quite an I've had so many powerful experiences meditating on the horizon line between the sky and the ocean, where it disappears into infinity. I have found that God shows up in that place. So I want you to invite you into paying attention to those natural places, because I think God shows up there. The divine is showing up here in these places this morning. So yeah, go never don't neglect those opportunities to go pray in natural places, to open yourselves to the presence of the divine, because the energy in those kind of places can be a little bit different, and it can help us get opened up. And this can also happen out back by your bird feeder. Can also happen walking down I know some of you like to get out and walk in your neighborhoods. The divine is there in the flowers, in your neighbors, in the creatures that you see, in the hills that you see behind there. So make sure you notice that. When evening came, again, it's dark. He was there alone, but by this time the disciples' boat, battered by the waves, were far from the land, for the wind was against them. So the disciples are already gone out here, and they are in a stormy, scary place. Early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. Again, here's the fear. saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." I'm gonna put on my Jungian hat for just a second, and also I want to lift up the quote in the beginning of the bulletin from Dion Fortune. She says that water is the element of emotion and unconscious. So I want to get symbolic and metaphorical with this because I think within this story, as we talk about water, sea, turbulence, storminess, windiness, it's a beautiful metaphor for our own emotional shadow stuff. By shadow, I'm talking about that stuff we push down in ourselves or in our collective and don't want to deal with. The shadow, the shadow is funny. It'll show up like, Christy and I are talking about something and she says something I don't like, and all of a sudden I start getting very teary or manipulative or some sort of thing that she has triggered in me. That's something coming up in me from my shadow that needs to be healed. You hear that? And it comes out in all kinds of different ways in our lives where we get triggered, something makes us uncomfortable, and our shadow shows up. Our shadow is showing up in our nation a lot right now. A lot of things are coming up that we have pushed down and not dealt with. And this is a scary thing. It's also a very healing thing. I want you to hear this as a healing process. When the shadow pushes emotional stuff up that we haven't dealt with and puts it right in front of us, it may be really uncomfortable, but it is also a healing process. It's a good thing. And so I want you to hold that here because I think this story is about that on a metaphorical level. It's about that emotional stuff being pushed up and causing all this storm in our lives. And sometimes the storm is caused by inner circumstances, sometimes it's caused by outer circumstances. Some of you did not ask for the things you are going through right now. So there's an outer circumstances can cause that turbulence and storminess within us, can cause that emotion that symbolized by water to get really whipped up in us. So if you look at it metaphorically like that, how does it become possible to stay on top of it? How does it become possible to float? How does it become possible to walk on water? I think floating is a better metaphor for us, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to go ahead and walk through this with you. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But then he noticed the strong wind, and he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Here's Matshona Dhiliwayo. Don't think about sharks when you're walking on water. This is this is what Peter does here. He starts thinking about the sharks. He starts getting scared. He starts thinking about the wind and that he's probably there's an element of, oh my gosh, I'm really doing this, and he starts sinking. So what does, and this was what happens to us, and I'm going to speak metaphorically here again, when we're wrangling with our emotional stuff. It's really important that we find ways to float on it instead of sink into it too much. As Paulo Coelho says, you drown not by falling in a river, but by staying submerged in it. So how when we are getting submerged, how when we are slipping under, do we find ways to float, or here to walk on water? How do we find ways to float? I want to I want to call out this thing of cultivating peace and cultivating calmness. Jesus has said over and over again, he shows up for the disciples after the resurrection and breathes on them and says, "Peace be with you." Says it multiple times. Peace be with you. How do we cultivate peace in these stormy places, in these places where we are alone? Notice in the Johannine version of this, the disciples have gone out and Jesus is not with them yet. There's this feeling of separation from the divine. Granted, that is just a feeling. We are never separated from the divine, but the feeling is there. And so, how do we deal with the fear that comes up? Peter, who I love Peter, you know that he's impulsive. He jumps into things with both feet. He's just done that here, and he's walking on water, and now he's sinking. And he, but he knows what to do because he cries out, "Lord, save me." It is always a very good idea to call on God to help us through these stormy places in our lives. When our emotions are washing over us, when we are sinking, when we are far from the shore, when we have gotten out of a boat that we're now thinking, "Gosh, that looked pretty good," or maybe the boat sunk, or maybe maybe we can't get back in that boat anymore. There's a little bit of a threshold image there with the boat. We turn around and the boat's gone, or the boat's sunk, or maybe we just don't want to go back to that boat. That's not our boat anymore. What do we do? And Peter shows us here, he calls out, "Lord, save me. Lord, help me." That's the best prayer in the world. God, help me. Please. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm sinking. There are lots of sharks. Help me float. Help me still this inner turbulence and this inner storm in myself so I can be discerning, so I can make better decisions, so I can get to the next moment and the next day, or if you're laying in your bed in the middle of the dark, so you can get to the daylight. What is it that creates calmness in you? And that's maybe a really good question for us this morning is, what is it that stills your storm? What is it that helps you find that calm place and get your lake, your water looking a little more like Manzanita did in that photo? Just a few ripples on top, because you'll be able to move forward and float on top of it or walk on it better. I want to wrap up with what Jan Richardson said, because I don't want you to. Also, I just want to thank Scout and Jackie, because this was the way they did the reading of preparation and the setup for that had the perfect effect, at least on me, to set up for this sermon, because there was a calming element to it. Did you hear that? There was the calming. First of all, changing stuff up, changing our spiritual practices up is also a really good thing, because it's really interesting to watch what we do. Oh, this is different. What's this? Or maybe it's like, wow, that feels really different than the way I usually do it. So they did a very wise thing that I think is another way for us to cultivate that sense of calmness and to still the storms in our lives, is to find spiritual practices. And I love, be still and know that I am God. Be still. Be still Be still. I want you to listen to that. There's that calmness factor. How do we get the waters to be still? By knowing that God is God. And by inviting that energy in all the ways we do. Another way to do it is through music. You know, I saw your faces this morning when the singers were singing and Bo was playing, and I'm going to invite Bo here in a little bit to introduce his friends to us, because I'd like to know who they are, because they've brought us tremendous joy this morning. And I saw your faces light up when you heard the music. There is something about listening to music. There's something about prayer and spiritual practices. There's something about getting out in nature. And Jan Richardson also points to a couple things in this little blessing that she has written as well. She talks about being drawn toward the voice. What voices are you drawn to? What voices repel you? Are there voices that whip up your storm? We all have voices in our lives that whip up our storms, that whip up our emotional stuff. We have those loved ones that can activate us into places that are hard for us to imagine when we're sitting calmly. They can activate us into places of anger, of grief, of sadness. And let me just say that those folks are very important teachers for us. If you have people in your life that you are close enough to, that they can mirror and reflect back to you what's going on in yourself that way, you have a gift. That's one of the reasons that God calls us before all things to be in relationship with one another. Because those relationships are a dance. And when we get our emotional body gets turbulent and we lose our calmness because of what other people are doing in our lives, it may be about us, or we may need to set a boundary, which is also about us. So I want you to notice that. Who are the voices in your life that stir you up? Who are the voices that help you be calm? Oftentimes, here's the trick, they're the same people. They do both. That's not always true, but sometimes it's true. Watch who's mirroring what to you. Toward the voice that calls us, the love that catches us. Cultivate love in all things. Foremost, cultivate it for yourself. Care for yourself. Love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. God will show up for you. That's part of the covenant. God will show up for you in those places. The love will catch us, as Jan says. And the faith that carries us. There's this beautiful tension in these scriptures between faith and doubt, which we talked about with Thomas, when we talked about Thomas. Where are those tensions in your life between faith and doubt? This is a really creative, good tension. We can't just go off on faith and say, yeah, la, 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 yeah, and not pay attention to what's going on around us. And yet, it's important sometimes to be discerning and maybe a tiny bit skeptical. The word that's translated doubt here means it's interesting because this is not the normal word translated doubt. It means discerning more than it means skeptical. in this scripture. So I want you to notice that as well. When Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" The word translated there is more, "Why were you not more discerning?" And I think that's really important for us. So continue to cultivate that tension between faith and doubt in your life. It's rich for all of us. And there is a lot of relationship with the divine to be had in that place. Okay, so where are you thinking this morning? Where are you floating or walking on water? Where do you need to call out to God for help?